Hi everyone, it's Vic from Vic and Wes. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing the 20 books that I read in January. I normally do not read this many books. I believe I was able to read these many books because I tend to listen to audiobooks at 2 times speed, sometimes 3 times speed, depending on the narration. And I listen to these audiobooks a couple hours before I go to bed. So the amount of books just added up from there. The first book that I read is Better Than the Movies by Lynn Painter. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. It combined my two favorite things, movies and romance. Put them together, I am happy. I rated this 5 out of 5 stars, and my review says, "Thank you, Haley Pham, for recommending this book during one of your YouTube videos. This was an amazing book to start off 2023 with. They always say the book is better than the movie. This book doesn't have a movie, yet is amazing and honestly feels like watching a movie. It's adorable." I read this book from January 1st to January 2nd, 2023. The next book that I read was They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. I rated this book 5 out of 5 stars. My review says, "A great book about friendship and how you would live your last day if you knew it was your last day to live." I read this from January 1st to January 3rd. The third book on my list is Jane Against the World, Roe v. Wade and the Fight for Reproductive Rights by Karen Blumenthal. I rated this 5 out of 5 stars. My review says, "Very interesting to learn about the history of women's reproductive rights." I read this from January 1st to January 3rd, 2023. The main reason I picked this up was because of the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. I read We Were Liars. I rated this 5 out of 5 stars. My review says, "Such a beautifully written, tragic book." And I read it in one sitting from January 3rd to January 3rd. 3 times speed. 5 on my list is Heartless by Marissa Meyer. I rated this 5 out of 5 stars. My review says, "I now understand why the Queen of Hearts is the way she is and where the infamous line of 'off with his head' comes from." I read this book from January 3rd to January 5th, 2023. I love a good villain origin story, and that was just this, and I loved every minute of it. I have not read Alice in Wonderland yet, and I know it's a classic. It is on my TBR. I will get to it eventually. The next book that I read was The Sword of Summer, the first book in the Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard series by Rick Riordan. I rated this 5 out of 5 stars, as I do any Rick Riordan book that I read. Not only because it's nostalgic for me to read, he's a wonderful writer, and also I grew up with the Percy Jackson books. My review says, "Such an interesting first read, I couldn't put it down." And I read this book from January 6th to January 7th. I read The Golden Couple by Geir Hendricks and Sarah Pekkanen. I rated this 5 out of 5 stars. My review says, "I wasn't expecting a mystery when I picked this up. Granted, I didn't know much about it before reading." I read this book from January 5th to January 8th. Next, I read Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. I rated it 5 out of 5 stars, and my review just simply says, wow, just wow. I read this from January 8th to January 10th. Next, I read a fun YA romance, To All the Boys I've Loved Before, by Jenny Han. I have already seen the To All the Boys I've Loved Before trilogy on Netflix, so I knew how this book was going to go. However, I was pleasantly surprised by the changes the movie made to the book version. I rated this 4 out of 5 stars, and my review says, such a cute, cozy read, and I read this from January 10th to January 11th. I am probably going to continue on with this series because book 1 ended differently than the movie. Next book I don't even really want to talk about because of how disappointed I was in it, but I will. That book is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. I rated this book 2 out of 5 stars, and my review says, I loved the concept of this book before I read it. It was interesting. While listening to the audiobook, however, I found myself being able to predict what was going to happen. I didn't really like the self-help book feel of this either. I read it for Nora's story, not to be preached to. I view reading as an escape from my reality. So while reading this book, I did not appreciate the subtle hints of if you are feeling depressed or if you have anxiety, do this and look on the bright side of things. That is a lot easier said than done. Book that I read, which I enjoyed much better, was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I rated this 4 out of 5 stars. My review says I can see why this won Best Romance of 2019. Of course, I was going to pick this book up. It's a romance between the Prince of England and the first son of the first woman president of the United States. This book from January 12th to January 15th. This book that I read, I was also disappointed in. It was Family of Liars by E. Lockhart. This is the prequel to We Were Liars. I rated this book 3 out of 5 stars. My review says this book was good, but I don't really think it was needed. In my opinion, it didn't add really anything to the story that We Were Liars had already put out. The next book that I read was Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. I rated this book 5 out of 5 stars. My review simply says I now want black cake because it sounds really good. And I did not know much about going into this book, and it was the best thing, honestly, because it just made the reading experience that much better, in my opinion. And I read this book from January 11th to January 17th. This book that I read, I absolutely loved, and I recommend it to anyone that is a true crime listener or someone that listens to podcasts. This book being Sadie by Courtney Summers. I rated this book 5 out of 5 stars. My review says I listened to this by audiobook and it was amazing. Full cast of characters and in a podcast format. I read this book from January 17th to January 18th. This book that I read is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I rated this book 5 out of 5 stars, and my review simply says, "Excuse me while I go cry." This book is beautiful, and I now know Achilles' heel. This book that I read physically, and that is The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. I immensely loved this book. I loved the puzzles aspect of it, and I actually found myself trying to solve the puzzles with the characters while they were going through this. I rated this 5 out of 5 stars, and my review says, "Such a fun game. I need book 2 ASAP." I read this book from January 4th to January 22nd. I have yet to read books 2 and 3, but I do have them. The next book that I read via audiobook is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. If you don't know, Suzanne Collins is the author of the Hunger Games trilogy, which is one of my favorite series of all time. This book follows who would become President Snow. It's his story, his villain origin story, which I honestly really enjoyed reading. 4 out of 5 stars, and my review says, "I enjoyed this more than I thought I would." I read it from January 22nd to January 23rd. Next book I read in tandem, the audiobook and the physical book. This was Spare by Prince Harry. There we go. That's a better view of it. I absolutely loved this book, and I love that Prince Harry was finally able to tell his story. My review says, "Thank you, Prince Harry, for telling your story." I rated it 5 out of 5 stars, and I read this book from January 10th to January 30th. The last book that I read in January, I read this book physically, but I don't have it with me right now, was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. I rated this 5 out of 5 stars, and my review says, "My reread has started. I will never rate this less than 5 stars," which is true because nostalgia and also Harry Potter holds a close place in my heart. I love it so much. And I reread it every year. Okay, that is all the 20 books that I read this January. I hope you enjoyed.